Hello everyone, my name is Dan and I make competitive Warhammer 40k content. Today we're going to be talking about transports in Warhammer 40k. I believe the transports are one of the most misplayed and underutilized units in the game. The rules aren't that complicated, but it seems like people get them wrong all the time. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go over a deep dive of the transports rules, some frequently asked questions and special case scenarios. And then we'll get into the tactics of not only how to use transports, but also how to go against transports. So even if you don't use any in your games, I highly recommend you watch the video all the way through so you can see, if people are using their transports incorrectly, as well as how you can counter them. So when I talk about transports, I don't just mean dedicated transports unit slots in a codex. I'm talking about anything that can carry troops. So transport is actually a keyword that can be used in many different units. For example, a drop pod would have the transport keyword, but so does a land raider, a rhino, and even some aircraft have the transport keyword. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, is that transport keyword. The first thing you want to do is look at what type of carrying capacity a transport has. They're actually not all equal. So for example, a rhino might be able to take 10 non-Primaris, non-jump pack troops, but an impulsor might only be able to take 6 Primaris type troops. And then a drop pod might be able to take a dreadnought in it. So it's very important that you're actually putting things inside a transport that can legally be inside of it. I've actually seen that at tournaments before where people have units inside a transport that are not legally allowed to be in there, so always check that. The other thing that's important to know about transports is that they're deployed at the same time as a unit that's transported inside of them. So if you're deploying and it's your turn to deploy, you put the Rhino and the 10 Repentia all at the same time. So essentially 2 units act as 1 drop in your deployment, and that's important to know. The next thing we're going to be talking about is how to embark and disembark units in transports, because that's also something that gets often pretty wrong. So first, let's start with embarking and how that works. Embarking means getting into a transport. So a unit can embark into a transport if they've either done a move, an advance, or fallen back, and they're all within coherency and wholly within 3 inches of a transport. Now, you can't embark into a transport that is in engagement range of an enemy unit. So if a unit started its movement phase inside a transport, it is allowed to disembark on that movement phase. What that means is it can leave and be wholly within 3 inches of the transport and then still make its normal move. But a unit cannot disembark if the transport made a move, advance, or falling back. So that's important to know too. You can't do is slingshot your troops forward by moving your rhino, then disembarking, then moving, then charging. You can't do any of that. In fact, you can't even disembark if you've moved your transport. Of course, there are some stratagems that, for example, White Scars have that allow you to do this, but the vast majority of people do not have that capability. And then there are some transports that have special rules, like impulsors, that are also able to do that. So it's very important that you check the baseline is that transports cannot move and then disembark. They need a special rule to allow them to do so. Even if that unit exits the Rhino and then stands still, it still counts as having moved because it disembarked that same turn. It's important to know that a unit can only disembark if they can end wholly within 3 inches of that transport, in coherency, and not within engagement range of any enemy. And that's going to come into play when we're looking at how to counter different transports. So when a transport dies, you follow a pretty simple 3-step process. The first thing you do is roll a d6 and see if your transport explodes if it has that rule. You do all the mortal wounds associated with that before you disembark any of your troops. Then what you do is you place all of your troops outside, wholly within 3 inches of the transport, outside of engagement range, and within inside coherency. Any model that can't be placed this way is automatically killed. Then what you do is you roll a d6 for every troop you have on the field, and any 1 counts as them being destroyed. You then remove those casualties. The third step is actually removing the transport itself. So a couple key takeaways from that is when you explode, you never explode and deal damage to the troops inside the transport. And 2, you have to put all your models down before you remove the actual transport body. And in the rules, you also specify that a unit cannot charge or heroically intervene the turn they disembarked. So what some people may try to do and think they're really clever is move their transport, shoot it to destroy their own transport, disembark, and then try to charge, but they're not able to do that. You're not allowed to charge if your unit's disembarked from an explosion. Okay, now let's go over some special rules and commonly asked questions. One question that sometimes gets asked is, what if the model is too big to actually disembark and be wholly within 3 inches of the transport? Now this is different than having units that can't fit because there's other troops blocking them, because those automatically die. This is if the base is literally too big to be wholly within 3 inches. For those, they just have to be within 1 inch of the transport. So another really common question is, how do auras and strats work for units that are embarked inside a transport? And the answer is they don't. If you have like a captain with reroll 1's aura inside a rhino, there is no aura coming from that rhino. If you have a strat that someone could use who's inside the rhino, they cannot use it. It's as if those models are not on the battlefield at all. That includes different relics and things like that. Let's say you have a relic that says every time your opponent does a stratagem, you roll a d6, on a 5+, you get a command point. If your unit is embarked in a transport, you do not get that benefit. And the third question is about open top transports. So normally units cannot shoot outside of a transport. However, if the transport has the open top rule, they are allowed to shoot out. And the easiest way to think about how an open top transport works is just imagine if all of the weapon profiles of your units were just put onto the transport. So that means that if the transport advanced, then the units cannot shoot unless they have the ability to advance and shoot. If your transport is engaged in combat, then the only type of people that can shoot outside of it during the shooting phase are ones that have pistols. So all the same rules apply to the units inside the transport as the ones outside. Same with dense cover, everything. If it would apply to the transport, it applies to the troops inside. Okay, now that we understand how these rules work, let's get into the actual tactics and why transports can be so useful. The first is that many of them are very fast and much faster than some of the ground troops you have. Do you want to be moving an impulsor 14 inches a turn, or do you want to be walking your blade guard up 6 inches a turn? So not only does it massively increase the mobility of some of your troops, it also makes them much harder to be hurt. Let's say you've got a 5-man squad of Retributors with 5 multi-meltas. Now, those toughness 3 bodies and 3+ saves are not going to protect them, but if you put them inside a Rhino, you can guarantee that they're going to be much harder to kill than if they're by themselves. So there's an inherent synergy between models that are slow and fast transports, as well as models that are squishy that you want to protect, and tough transports. So that's the real benefit of transports, is moving units quickly and protecting your softer bodies. That's kind of the beginner obvious synergy. But there's a few different tactics you can actually do with transports to make them worth even more than their speed and durability. The first thing you can do is use them to soak Overwatch. So in Warhammer 40k, you cannot shoot Overwatch if you're already engaged in combat. So let's say you've got a Rhino, 10 Repentia, and you're staring down a 10-man unit of Rubric Space Marines with Flamers. If you charge those Repentia in, they're all going to instantly die on the Overwatch, I can almost guarantee it. But what you can do is actually charge your Rhino in first, and then your Repentia. Because you're not able to shoot Overwatch if you're already engaged, the Rhino would either soak up the initial Overwatch damage, or prevent the Rubric Marines from being able to shoot at the Repentia. The second important tactic is move blocking. So if you remember from disembarking, you have to exit the transport before you move the transport. Your troops can get outside of the transport, move, and then have your transport advance to a different area and move block. So recently, someone used Rhinos and Khorne Berserkers really well against me. So what they did is they disembarked their Khorne Berserkers from the Rhino 3 inches forward, and then moved them an additional 6 inches. So essentially extended the movement of these Khorne Berserkers from 6 to 9 inches, giving them a longer threat range. Those Khorne Berserkers ended up charging one of my units, and then he advanced the Rhino in between 2 buildings and kind of pushed it sideways. So I had a unit of Blade Guard veterans on the other side who would have loved to charge and clean off all these Khorne Berserkers, but they couldn't because they had to go through the Rhino first. And of course, if I attacked that Rhino, I would destroy it, maybe it would explode on me, who knows, but then those Khorne Berserkers would just move over and charge my Blade Guard the next turn. So always look for how you can continue to protect your units through move blocking. The next is screening characters. Many transports have enough wounds that they count for the Lookout Sir rule. That means what you can do is essentially disembark your troops and then move your Rhino back to screen a character. And many transports are actually relatively big, so you can use them to block line of sight. So even if you can't get within 3 inches to give the lookout sir rule to a character, what you can do is actually just block the enemy's line of sight. Rhinos are conveniently about the same size as a Space Marine, so as long as you don't do too much modeling for disadvantage on yourself, what you can do is essentially just park a Rhino through an alleyway, and troops that are, about Space Marine size height should not be able to see other Space Marines on the other side. And I already mentioned it before, but one of the real benefits of disembarking 2 and using transports is that you're effectively extending your threat range. Normally a unit can move their movement speed and then roll 2d6 to get a maximum of 12 inches of charged threat range. However, transports allow you to be disembarked 3 inches forward, so essentially that gives you 3 more inches to your movement phase of troops that have disembarked from a transport. So now you take your guy who initially had a 6-inch movement and an 18-inch threat range to a 9-inch effective movement and a 21-inch threat range. I've got 3 tactics that I suggest you try to use against transports in your next game. The first tactic I suggest you do is surround a transport to the point where you're going to automatically kill all the units inside. So we talked about before is that when a unit disembarks, they have to have space to put a model before they actually remove the transport. But also, units can't be placed within engagement range of another enemy troop. So you imagine every enemy troop around a transport is exerting not only their base size, but also a 1-inch bubble around themselves. And you can see that it's not exactly to scale, but you can see that it takes about 7 32mm bases in order to prevent any 32mm bases from disembarking from a Rhino if you've surrounded it well enough. And you don't even have to be in melee combat to do this. You can actually surround a Rhino in your movement phase, exerting all of your area of control with your engagement range, then shoot it, and the models that would come out during that same shooting phase would not be able to because they could not be placed outside of engagement range. Another very similar tactic, and this is going to not win you any friends in your casual games, is to surround the transport during your movement phase and then not actually attack it. On your opponent's turn, they're not going to be able to disembark because they can't legally disembark any of their troops. So what you can do is you can just surround an enemy's transport, preventing them from ever being able to disembark. The only option for them is to essentially have their Rhino charge you and try to fight its way out. Otherwise, it's just going to be sitting there never being able to disembark. Most transports are incredibly weak in combat, and so that actually gives you a pretty good benefit because what you can do is you can wrap and trap it in combat, and I've talked about that in my combat tips video, but it's even more easy and important against transports. So to reiterate, if you have 3 points of contact on the base of a transport, it will not be able to move out of combat. And units that are in combat cannot be shot at by units outside of the combat. So what you can actually do is, surround a transport, don't kill it, your opponent's turn, they can't shoot you, they can't fall back, and then what you can do is kill their transport on their turn, and then you take your turn and can move and charge and kill more of their guys. So always look for ways that you can wrap and trap transports in combat. I also highly recommend what you do when you're playing against a transport is to try to kill it in the shooting phase and then have something that can charge the units that come out. What you don't want to do is spend all of your turn shooting a transport to destroy a useless Rhino for a unit of melee troops to come out of it and then charge you and kill you on your opponent's next turn. So always have a plan to actually kill the units inside the transport if you're going to go through the effort of actually cracking that nut. So there's also a really important stratagem that you need to know about transports, and that's emergency disembarkation. Now this is one of the core rule stratagems. What it essentially allows you to do is you spend 1 CP when a transport is destroyed, only when a transport is destroyed, and you get to put your models wholly within 6 inches as opposed to 3. But then when you roll a d6 for each troop that gets out, a 1 or 2 automatically kills them. So recently at a tournament, I got really, they really got me. The opponent really used emergency disembarkation well against me. So I had a unit of Inceptors, which had an 18-inch range, who shot at a Rhino. Now I thought, okay, worst case scenario, what will happen is these guys will get outside of the Rhino 3 inches, be able to move 6 inches, and then still need a 9-inch charge to get to me. That's a risk I'm willing to take. But what he did is he actually used emergency disembarkation, got to disembark 6 inches, then on his turn moved 6 inches, and only needed a 6-inch charge to actually get and kill all of my Inceptors with his Khorne Berserkers. So I was not thinking about the fact that emergency disembarkation actually gave his models about 3 extra inches of movement if I destroyed the transport on his turn. So emergency disembarkation is a tool you really need to be thinking about. Not only can it make it harder for you to wrap and trap a unit, it can also extend the threat range of models inside a transport if you kill that transport on your opponent's turn. So please, before you smash those rhinos, make sure to smash the like button and think about if emergency disembarkation is going to ruin you. I'm a huge fan of transports, and I hope everyone got something out of this video. If there was a misconception about transports that you just learned today, please put that in the comment section and share it with your friends, so that way everyone can actually learn how transports work. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.